a trained mystic touches something and then comes back to space-time, and then touches that and comes back to space-time hundreds of times during the day. And each time they come back to space-time, self and world re-arise. And there is a kind of refreshment because you had 50 milliseconds of contact with something that was outside of space-time, at least seemed to be, or perceptually, and outside of form. And then you actually can observe, first person, observing how that formless vibrates the sensory experience of self and world into existence and then out of existence again. So in the Jewish mystical tradition, they call this Bri'ah Yesh Me'ayin in Hebrew. It's continuous, an awareness of the creation of self and world and the annihilation of self and world. And then using that in the service of taking feedback from people and being a better person, because you now have a kind of Archimedean place to stand where it gives you objectivity.
Welcome to Mu. Today's episode is with Shinzen Young and Bernardo Kastrup. Shinzen is a mindfulness teacher, is the author of the Science of Enlightenment, and is a co-director of the SEMA lab at the University of Arizona. Bernardo Kastrup is a metaphysical idealist, analytic philosopher, computer engineer, and is the executive director at the Essentia Foundation. This is an open dialogue between the two, exploring the topics of mysticism and science. If you enjoy this content, you can help support it by joining our Patreon or by making a donation down at the link below. And so with that, I'm very happy to introduce this episode with Shinzen Young and Bernardo Kastrup.
I'm interested in how you would see philosophy, science, and mystical experience, you, Bernardo, how you would see that, those things aligning possibly or working together, moving forward to help us in what I'm going to describe as I think, a time of crisis and probably more crisis because change is a coming.
I, a lot of people talk about the unification of science and spirituality. I don't think that's the proper goal. It's like trying to unify a hammer and a hacksaw. They both lose their usability. They both lose their strength. I think different tools are good for different types of problems, and they can be complementary. If you want to build a barn, you need the hammer and you need the hacksaw, but you don't want to fuse them together. So I'm not pro a fusion of science and mysticism, or even a fusion of science and philosophy. I think wisdom resides in knowing under what circumstances to use what tool, and I think all three tools are valuable. One of the core aspects of the scientific methodology is that the experimenter should try as much as possible to exclude their own influence on the experimental result. One tremendously erroneous way to do science would be to inject the subjectivity of the experimenter deliberately into the dynamics of the experiment. That would invalidate science as a method and probably invalidate introspective insight as well, to the extent that one is trying to dress that up under the coating of empirical experimentation, objective empirical experimentation. Both have to lose from that. And that's not even to talk about pseudoscience. which is the form of science, but none of the actual values and methodologies of science. So I don't think anybody stands to gain by fusing things together. I think we stand to gain by understanding what tool is good under what circumstances and using them accordingly.
So you would see a loss of objectivity as a main sign of a bad fusion. I also understand what you're saying, that tools can be complementary. They don't have to be the same thing. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, okay, so what would be some good ways for them to work together?
We are living beings, and our life experience is constituted of many aspects. We inform our own inner life about ourselves and the world outside through many methodologies. And science is one, introspective insight is another, philosophical speculation is yet another. Those are all parts of the grand palette of life. And then how do they come together? They come together in a life. That's what we call a life. It's the coming together of all of these different aspects. And it's not only these three, there are other aspects like relating to another human being. Is that pure introspective insight? No, there is another human being over there. Is this science? No, you're relating to the sum total of the other human being, including the other's experiential inner life. And that's partly scientific, but not fully. Is this purely philosophy? No, it's about loving another human being. It's not purely philosophy, although continental philosophy touches on it. So the way they come together doesn't require, I think, a systematic conceptual structure that someone sits on a chair and devises. They come together in in the dynamics of lived experience, in the dynamics of life itself. I can only relate what my own experience has entailed over the past few years. Um, the closest thing that has come to what you might describe as liberation for me. I'm not liberated in this grand sense, not at all. I still suffer daily, regularly, in all kinds of ways, most of them self inflicted. But I suffer less than I used to suffer 10 years ago. And part of it was, and I think we talked about it last time, Lucas, part of it is the realization in the second half of life that my life is not about me, has never been about me, will never be about me, and that the attempt to carry responsibility for all the unfoldings of my life puts me in the position of Atlas, of having to carry the weight of the world in my shoulders, while I don't have anywhere near the power of Atlas, and that is incredibly not only frustrating, that is oppressive and claustrophobic. And understanding that your life or my life has never been about me is both a liberation, but seemingly paradoxically, it's also the realization that you are a tool of nature, that life is a kind of service. And I don't mean by this something romantic. I mean by this something very pungent and difficult, which is to be in service of nature, to be in service of the flow of the transpersonal as it goes through you. Um, that can be very tough because the transpersonal doesn't give a damn about your personal safety or happiness or comfort or your egoic list of desires. It doesn't give a damn about any of that. So you could both describe it from one perspective as a kind of slavery. Um, And from another perspective, you could describe the same thing equally validly as a kind of liberation. It's the liberation of the slave. It's that it's the profound freedom of being in confinement, knowing that this is what it's all about. And if you can be free in solitary confinement, then you truly are free. And I intuit that that's the art of the second half of life.
Wow. Yeah.
It's not a practice, it's life.
Well, it's an insight.
If we suffer enough, we all get to some insights, right?
Yeah, that's a little bit of a non-trivial insight, I'm going to say, from my perspective. So my curiosity is, to what extent was this fueled by psychedelics? To what extent was it fueled by your thinking about things, life events? I'm really interested because, once again, you really nailed something here. I mean, if you ask me to say it, it's exactly what you just said. You are everything. it, you're the master and the slave, uh, and you're only the master because you know how to be the slave. It's exactly what you're saying. You said it perfectly. So I'm interested how you got the insight.
Not psychedelics. I did psychedelics during a more or less limited period of my life, a couple of years, and it's been over 10 years ago. So no, this didn't come from psychedelics. Psychedelic experience is very profound, but it's also a manifestation of what I like to call the prime directive of mind, which is to deceive itself, and it's it requires a certain degree of paying attention for one to notice how much of the psychedelic experience is self-deception, a kind of a carrier of a deeper meaning. But to see that deeper meaning, you have to pay a lot of attention. But even those deeper meanings were not the origin of what I just told you. And it wasn't bookish philosophizing either. You certainly don't get anywhere near this with academic philosophy. You get, if anything, you get very far away from what I just described, because academic philosophy is conceptual. It puts a conceptual barrier between one and one's lived experience, especially analytic philosophy. Continental philosophy is closer to lived experience, as Nietzsche showed us all. Um, but what I just told you, it's the product of paying attention to life as you suffer. I mean, this is the product of suffering, right? But we live in a culture in which we try to insulate ourselves as much as possible from suffering. We turn suffering into something to be overcome through recipes, through procedures, and often it doesn't help. And for me, it definitely didn't help. So I think if there is any difference between me and Joe Average and Jane Average, maybe I have a disposition to pay attention even to the unfolding of suffering. And if you pay attention to it, certain things in life are, I think, are inescapable unless you have the means to keep on distracting yourself all the way to your deathbed, which unfortunately a lot of us are very good at distracting ourselves all the way to our deathbed, and then realizing what's going on 30 seconds before you're out of the game. But if you have my disposition, which is not a merit, it's just the way I was put together, it's how I was born, I can't help but pay attention. And then you realize that the whole notion that your life is about yourself, which is the foundation of Western well being, um, which is, you take the reins of your life and, you are responsible for your happiness. That all of this is an assumption that has no foundation whatsoever. And that it has a very detrimental effect of giving you responsibility for a natural unfolding over which you have absolutely no control. And if you pay attention, you notice it. And I noticed it. And maybe I'll change my mind 20 years from now if I live that long. I don't know. But right now, this is my lived experience. It's the coming to terms with this lived experience that it's not about me, has never been, will never be, and the best I can do is to be of service to nature. Christian mythology gives us hints about that. You know, the life of sacrifice. There is something to that, I think. So if you're looking for how did I get here, can I share and help other people get here? No, I can't. I suffered my way into this, and I didn't choose to be where I am. So I can't help anybody other than to say there is something somewhere, and you may bump into it if you suffer enough. that, that that's the best I can say. I can't be of further help.
So this was basically your life experience of various kinds of suffering have led you to what I'm going to describe as really quite a profound insight. Particularly the way you said it is the way someone would say it if they really experienced it. And so it's interesting to me because you almost parroted words that I speak when I'll sometimes say, okay, I'm going to speak poetically now. And I would say something close to what you said to sum up the situation of a human being. So I think you're aware that in Buddhism, they talk about the Four Noble Truths. You're familiar with this, I'm sure. It's part of the introduction to philosophy course. So, and the first one is the truth of suffering. So you looked at that carefully in your life and you came to an extraordinary conclusion. I would say you can help people by in the way you just did, by saying what you just said. That does help people.
Maybe on the other hand, I'm going against the the foundational assumption of Western self-help, which is you have to take the reins of your life, and I'm speaking against it. But yeah,
Well, there's a kind of fundamental paradox in the world's mystical traditions. And you can see how different cultures have dealt with it. It shows itself in different ways. But I will say, broadly speaking, there's no way around it. There is a place on this path for cultivated improvements. You can systematically train things like flexible concentration, sensory clarity, a quality that we call technically equanimity, which is perhaps analogous to fluidity within a hydrodynamic system, roughly. So these are trainable skills, as I mentioned. So from one perspective, we can take the reins and make improvements. From another perspective, there's nothing to improve. It's early processing. I'm guessing that what the mystics of the world call the taste of now is related to what, as neuroscientists, we would call early processing, those first 100 or 500 or maybe even a few thousand milliseconds as visual, auditory perception, inner and outer, arises, as thought, speech, action on the expression gates, as that arises. At that moment of arising, there is, in each moment, no matter what the content of that experience is, there is an original okayness that's there. And it's not cultivatable. You don't need to cultivate it. It's already taken care of it. It's already taken care of it. So around the world, how to deal with this, how to deal with the fact that, in a sense, seeking is the problem. You're already there. On the other hand, look at the wretched parade of human history, how we're screwing ourselves and screwing ourselves. We're clearly not there. Something's wrong here, and we need to do something about it. So how this is dealt with around the world is mature or immature. And when it's immature, it leads to philosophical and even political conflict. When it's mature, it's good. Once again, my personal opinion. So what is this? So in Zen, for example, just to give a specific lineage, Chan, Zen, Chinese practice influenced by Indian Mahayana Buddhism. So in Zen, there's two schools of Zen, Soto Zen and Rinzai Zen. Soto Zen says you don't meditate to cultivate any focus factors. You don't meditate. You do sit a lot, but you just sit to express your faith in the primordial okayness of each moment. Rinzai Zen is different. They say you're deluded now, and after you've passed 1750 koans, you will not be deluded, and we'll get you to that. It'll take about 20 years in a monastery. Pretty rough training. And then you'll be there. So original enlightenment versus cultivated enlightenment. They argued about this in the Buddhist tradition. I'll have to say from my own experience, there's a place for both. There, you can definitely improve your focus factors through systematic training, just like you train a muscle. There's nothing all that strange about that. So in the West, this comes out as the division between Orthodox Christianity and Roman Catholic Christianity first. They divided on this. To what extent are these mystical experiences something you cultivate and you can get there? To what extent is it the exact opposite of that? You have to give up the fact that you're going to do anything. Passive contemplation, let God do it to you. So there's a very subtle distinction in Eastern Orthodox Catholicism versus Roman Catholic, arguing about the percentages caused a division within Christianity that was pretty vicious. The same argument comes up again with Protestantism. Luther was a failed meditator. He tried to meditate. It's hard. He couldn't do it. And he decided the problem is we can't do it. We can't practice. We can't do anything. Sola fide, sola gratia. It's all faith, and the faith itself is given by God. You don't merit it. So it's what broke the Roman Catholic from the Protestant, and then the Protestants also somewhat. So my perspective on this is that it's a little bit analogous to, is light a wave or a particle? There was vicious scientific debate for several centuries. It wasn't nice about this. Now we just accept the fact. You can look at it as wave, you can look at it as particle. That's a good thing, because sometimes one perspective, engineering-wise, is better. So I would say that broadly, all over the world, the mystics have to deal with this paradox that you can make cultivated improvements, but in the end, it's not about you.
I think part of the paradox is is self-created. Um, there is one big practice that we forget when we start looking for other practices, like the 1500 koans. We forget that life itself presents us with 15 billion koans. That life itself is a koan. Because life is hard, we we avoid doing the one thing that this whole thing is probably about, which is to pay attention to life, even or especially when it's hard, and to distract ourselves from the reality of life to some extent. And I know I'm choosing things to say that that go against the notion of a spiritual practice, because it's nice to have a discussion emerge from the seeming contradictions between us, but you shouldn't interpret that as my thinking that spiritual practice has no place. I actually think very actively that it does have a place, and I think it's one of the greatest losses in Western culture that we abandon spiritual practice. But it should not be engaged in as a distraction away from the practice of life, which is what we try to do with spirituality. Has become escapism. It's a way to escape the suffering of life because we all want to stop suffering. And in surrendering to that instinctive desire to stop suffering, which is legitimate, it doesn't feel good, so we want to stop suffering. But in surrendering to it, we miss out on the upside of suffering. We miss out on life. Because what is life about? Life is about maturing, growing up, becoming an adult. But we live in an adolescent society that is desperately seeking distractions away from the very things that could mature us, if only we would pay attention. So I think the paradox can be resolved by the practice of paying attention, which is not a separate practice from life. It's not a way to try to wrestle control of life. It's an attentive observation of life in and out. Because, you know, life does the trick. It has an uncanny ability to be a teacher. It's unbelievable sometimes how life comes to you and puts in front of you exactly that thing that you need, but you're most afraid of. It's like you pray to God, anything except that. And guess what? There's a knock at the door, and it is that. It's the very thing that comes around. Um, and then instead of paying attention to what then follows, we go do spiritual practice. And that is the great tragedy, I think.
I think I would not be comfortable characterizing spiritual practice as escapism only. If you take a look at what we call the Life Practice Program, it's on the internet, it's all archived. You'll see what you're saying is what we do. You could call it whatever you want. Uh, the only difference is we do it systematically. Somehow you were lucky enough that you got it without that systematic. But I don't remember the exact words you said. Something about being nature's slave and what, but then there was the other part. What was the other part? There was being nature's slave. And then you said, but at the same time, Bernardo, what were your words? Because it was quite moving.
It's the profound freedom entailed by the acceptance of being the slave of nature.
Yes, the freedom that comes from accepting being the slave of nature. So Spinoza famously said, Deus sive natura. Call it God, call it nature, I don't care. It's the same thing for me. He said that in Latin. That was very shocking to the Western world. I will have to say, in Chinese, the word for nature is tian, and the word for God is tian. It's the same characters. You can't even say, call it God or call it nature, because from that culture, it's the same thing to begin with. West not so much. Anyway, you could also say it's being God's slave, in a sense, if you wanted to. And I would actually be comfortable with that and still say that I am a rigorous, logic-based person, an evidence-based person. You call it being nature's slave. My poetry is you're God's slave. You're right about the Christian thing. It's not contradictory to science. It's evolutionary. It's, but that's another discussion. So the freedom that comes when you realize you are nature's slave. That was the phrase. Wow. I'm saying I do systematic practice. If a student came to me with that, I would say that's the insight function speaking. It's very, that's amazing.
We blocked ourselves away from what we might refer to as the natural teaching of life, what life naturally teaches us if lived with attention. We block ourselves away from that because unlike Spinoza, who realized that nature has two aspects, natura naturata, which is the which is nature begotten, it's the manifest, visible, measurable aspect of nature. But he understood that behind that there was natura naturans, nature begetting, the creative side of nature, which you could say is a minded side of nature. We forgot the second part. We think that nature is a kind of mechanical unfolding of a sort of clockwork mechanism that has some randomness inserted into it at the quantum level. And if nature is just this mechanical unfolding, a game of blind, non-conscious, non-minded natural laws, then if it has something to teach, then that's by pure chance, because a mechanism doesn't produce lessons. A mechanism doesn't go anywhere. It's just sort of a semi-random, semi-mechanic unfolding of blind stuff, um, and and that's materialism. That's physicalism. The notion that nature is fundamentally unminded, and that minds, which are the sort of the carriers of purpose, of meaning, of insight and understanding. That is all a sort of side effect of this dead mechanical play of nature. If that's what you believe, then life has nothing to teach. Of course not. What does a mechanism unfolding spontaneously by the application of recursive natural laws? What does it have to teach? Nothing. So to learn, we need practice that was devised by a minded being somewhere up in the Himalayas or something. Um, and we withdraw that lived relationship with nature as teacher, because behind natura naturata, there is natura naturans. In other words, and Spinoza was very clear about it in a letter he wrote at the end of 1675 to his friend Henry Oldengard. He said, because already in the last book he published in Life, before the Ethics, the Ethics was published posthumously, but in the Tractatus Politico, I forgot the whole name of, he already hinted at this understanding of God, Deus, and Natura as the same thing. But in that letter to Oldengard or Oldenburg, he says that people who think that he equaled God to nature in the sense of the material aspect of nature, mass, as a kind of aggregated mass, that those people did not understand what he meant, that those people took the wrong way. That would be the literal translation of the Latin, took the wrong way. And that's for the ones interested. I think this is letter 28 or 23 of the Epistola of Spinoza. That is wrong because he equated God with that which appears to us as nature, not to nature as a manifestation. Natura naturata is the appearance of God. It's what God looks like. But the being in itself of God, to speak Schopenhauerian language, that's the thing that projects the image. That's the thing that appears as nature. And that's natura naturans. That was God. So he had that understanding, and he has been now misunderstood for 4 centuries. But he had that understanding of nature, which we lost. If we were to recover that understanding, then maybe we would be more receptive to the notion of life as a practice, life as a teacher, which we've become disconnected to the moment we decided that the world is a mechanism and not the manifestation of a living, if spontaneous and instinctive intelligence.
I'm curious in your scholarship on Spinoza, if you have any idea how he came upon this. Do you think he had mystical experiences? Do you think it was just the rational conclusion to draw, from evidence? I'm impressed that you can quote the letters and the dates. Obviously, you've done some homework. So I, I my rabbi was very influenced by Spinoza, and that came across in my early development. So tell me what you know about his spiritual experience and why he might have come up with some of these things.
If he had spiritual experience, we do not have records that would allow us to unambiguously point that there are suspicions, there are hints, there are things that in our own minds we may think, well, this ought to have come from a spiritual experience. But he did not have a spiritual diary, that at least not that he left behind for us to study today. But I think to understand him and to understand why that might not have been needed at all, we have to place ourselves in the reality of the 17th century, just pre-enlightenment. That was deep into the Renaissance, but just before the Enlightenment. Spinoza died in 1675, 77. No, 75 or 77? 77, I think. Early in 77. In that world view, which was common at the time, that was the golden century in the Netherlands, the time of the De Witts, the time of great commerce and great world influence. Um, we did not relate to nature as we do today in enlightenment term. The enlightenment was still to happen. This rationalization of nature, the idea of matter as a metaphysical category different from psyche. In other words, different from spirit, mind, soul. These are all translations of the Greek word psyche. That came later. Spinoza did not live under this ethos. He lived under another ethos, which Owen Barfield describes very well in a book, one of the most undervalued books in the history of Western philosophy, a book called Saving the Appearances, which I would recommend to anyone. And what he shows there is that pre-enlightenment, we naturally and very instinctively understood the world as it appears to us to be, from its own perspective, what we are on the inside from our own perspective. What are we from the inside? From the inside, we are psyche. We are a conscious inner life. We are an experiential flow. We are spirit, which is another translation of the word psyche. And everybody intuitively understood that in the same way that our body is what our spiritual inside looks like when observed from the outside, that the world around us was just like us. It too had a spiritual insight that appeared to us as what we call the physical world. And nobody would need to write this because this was a given. So nobody wrote about it. It was the shared human way to relate to the world. And this is Spinoza's world, pre-enlightenment. What made Spinoza unique was that He was versed in the classics. He knew Euclidean geometry. He knew the Euclidean book on geometry, which tried to argue in very formal and structured terms using axioms, theorems, uh, uh, um, um,
Proofs. Yeah.
that sort of proofs my memory has some shortcomings because
I
of
think there were
medicine education.
common notions, axioms, definitions
Yeah,
for
all that. So
yeah,
that
yeah.
that formal structure of logic in making an argument, Spinoza tried to use that in the ethics. And the title ethics suggests that the book is all about ethics, but it's not. There's a lot of ontology and metaphysics in that as well. So that was Spinoza's unique move. He tried to capture an ethos that was common in his time, but unspoken, unarticulated. It was instinctive, spontaneous. People wouldn't even be able to tell themselves what that ethos was. But Spinoza had enough introspective capacity to, to discern that underlying worldview clearly and then give it structure according to Euclidean geometry almost. And that was the ethics. But I don't think he needed a particularly life changing spiritual insight for that. I think he was immersed in a sort of unspoken, uh, unmetacognitive or non metacognitive ethos that was characteristic of his time. And he just had the perception to unambiguously and explicitly recognize it and articulate it in formal terms. What he's describing was how people related to reality prior to the Renaissance, or certainly prior to the Enlightenment. What he argues is that that was the ordinary psychology of human beings before we replaced that with theoretical conceptualizations, which happened in the Enlightenment. And the link with Spinoza is that if Barfield's description is correct regarding that period of time in our history, then Spinoza lived in that time. And therefore, what Barfield describes Spinoza's ethos, the ethos in which he lived. And he articulated that ethos. And I would go even further and say that when Spinoza says that mind and matter are two aspects of the divinity, which leads many to think that Spinoza was a multi aspect monist, but not an idealist, because mind was not really the thing in itself. Mind was an aspect, a presentation. He used another word, which escapes me now, of the thing in itself. And the thing in itself is its own substance, and it was God. He did that because in his time, the word mind was synonym with human mind. But by that, we shouldn't construe that the divine essence of Spinoza was not a mental essence in the sense we give the word today, which is a category of existence that we happen to instantiate, but which is not one-on-one tied with human minds. There can be minds that are not human. There can be even mind at large, like Aldous Huxley wrote in the 1950s. Um, so there is a strong case to be made that Spinoza himself was an idealist, or what you would refer to perhaps as a non-dualist.
This is very interesting because most of the mystics and meditation masters of past history, they lived in the pre-Enlightenment world. And so that ethos that you're describing, that because there wasn't a scientific revolution in China like there was in Europe, for the whole history of Chinese meditation, it ran by the principle exactly what you mentioned. The way the outside world works we can know it by looking at how the inside world works. And so there's something called Neo-Confucianism, where this is all made very explicit. And of course, it's under Buddhist influence that it happened. Buddhism came in, represented a very new way to look at things, and took a little while for China to culturally, digest that. And when that was successfully done, the result was something that in Chinese is called Chan, in Japanese called Zen, and there's other words in Korea and Vietnam for essentially the same thing. So they had a notion that they called Gao Wu Zhi Zhi, which means investigate things and through that improve knowing. And that is still a word in Chinese that means science, but it was proto-science because they looked within and they got, I'm going to say, some pretty good stuff from doing that. Now, in the modern world, for me, one of the key theoretical questions is, okay, we've got some pretty good stuff from subjective reports of mystics and masters. How does that relate to what we now know from science? Because, as I said, you can find in those descriptions anything you want. They talk about fullness, they talk about emptiness, they talk about true self, they talk about no self. They talk about connection, they talk about isolation. All of these are like ways of describing something desirable, but they're sort of opposite sounding. So if we just look at the words from the mystical traditions of the world, it's not going to help us because we're going to just cherry pick what we want to emphasize. Because remember, it's all of humanity and it's all of recorded history that people have had both spontaneous and cultivated experiences like this. So what interests me is this this first person subjective, really good reports that you can get from experienced practitioners. How does this relate to the results of science, modern science? And that's a question. I don't have the answer to it, but my life is devoted to that question, I would say. So that what you said about Spinoza, I never thought of it that way. And the parallel with what I do know about the developments in China is very interesting. That's just a really different way to think about it. So great.
I like to say, and often people think I'm saying the opposite of it because it sort of contradicts their expectations. The truth is not vulnerable because it's what exists, it's what there is, and we are immersed in it. We are made of it. We are part of it, or are segments of it. Um, so it is no surprise. The truth is not fragile. So it's no surprise that through different methods, in different cultures, in different geographies, across different moments in time, people bumped their nose against the same thing because it's the thing that is right in front of them. It's the truth. It's what exists. It's not fragile. What is fragile are our accounts of the truth. And that has to do with mind having this fantastic and compelling disposition to self deception, which is, of course, the reason why we think we are egos. It's a form of self-deception. But mind can self-deceive in myriad other ways, and despite that, it is still introspection is still the royal avenue to knowledge. Schopenhauer already recognized that in the early 19th century. Um, so, how do we manage this? How do we manage the fact that the greatest benefit comes from the same method, i.e., introspection, out of which the greatest deceptions also come? And I think that's one of the values of science. Science gives you an objective, outside perspective, not invulnerable to self deception, as history shows, but a little more resilient to deception than pure introspection is. And it gives us a sort of a different perspective towards the truth. And if they both help us calibrate our worldviews, I think we have much to gain. I think that's the relationship. Both are looking at the same thing, but from very different perspectives, and those perspectives are complementary, I believe.
And so do I. Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. So I'm a trainer. That's what I do. I you know, sports trainers train your muscles. I train your focus factors. So I'm always interested in how do we train people? I got the crazy notion that we can train ordinary people in important parts of what I'm going to call the spirit of science. So this is, once again, from a practical point of view. It's like, okay, what are some things we can actually do with people? So when people study practice with me, I teach them about something that I call the spirit of science. So this is my way of attempting to just sort of encapsulate for a general public um, what science is. And I'd be very interested in your reactions to that because you have the training of a philosopher and a scientist. So once again, this is not rigorous philosophy. This is like, I have people, they're trying to improve their lives, they're willing to do a little bit of meditation every day, etc. What can I give them? How can I make this complementarity intrinsic to the way I'm teaching them meditation so that they get the best of both worlds? But they're actually trained in the best of both worlds. So I got a notion for explaining to the general public. Once again, this is not philosophically rigorous. It's meant to help general education. That four things constitute what I'm going to call the spirit of science. And the achievements of science are the body of knowledge that is currently science, which I tend to think of as roughly divided into four main areas: formal science, physical science, life science, and human science, psychology, you know, economics, linguistics, that kind of stuff. I call that human science. So that's the body of knowledge, the achievements of science. Now, often that's ascribed to the scientific method, but I prefer to think that behind the scientific method is a general way of communicating that generates quality narratives. What you just said, exactly what you just said. We look at the achievements of science. It's true, it's good, it's beautiful. It's as information, it is quality information. What generates quality information? I'm going to say we reanalyze the method of science and call it a way of humans generating and evaluating narratives. And then I teach them four things. if you're going to rely on anything, by the way, I didn't say you should rely on. I said, if you're going to rely on anything, rely on evidence and logic, respect respectable authority, respect, don't rely, and have a healthy sense of skepticism, which you can define as you wish, or we can talk about that, what that is. So I'm trying to develop an actual systematic training where people take the issues of their lives and start to think about them in terms of those criteria for creating and evaluating narratives. And then now we've got the best of both worlds, because they may not be trained in the specifics of science or any of the disciplines or know a theorem or a theory, but they got the essence. So I'm attempting to integrate, not make them the same thing, but have complementary training where there are training in focus factors that help you process sensory experience so you suffer less, are fulfilled more, get insights, and so forth. So those are sensory focused trainings. And then there's this sort of like little training in the spirit of science generically. And I want to put those together and have them be an integrated training. I'd be interested in just, Bernardo, your response to that as a scientist and philosopher.
Three of these are indisputably proper characterizations of the scientific mindset. If you are to rely on something, rely on reason in the sense of internal logical consistency. If you have a position that contradicts itself from within, then you may discard it. Empirical adequacy is important. So if you have a hypothesis about how nature behaves, go out and test that hypothesis. If you think that light objects fall slower than heavy objects, go out and test it, like someone did. Climbed the tower of Pisa and dropped two balls, one heavy, one light, and both arrived on the ground at the same time. So your hypothesis was false. So test the hypothesis. Don't do like the scholastics in the Middle Age, which had this armchair philosophy about how the world works, but they never went out to test the hypothesis. And the third one, to have a healthy dose of skepticism, to always doubt one's own stories, one's own hypothesis, to try to find ways to refute oneself, to disprove one's own ideas. That is core to the spirit of science. The part about authority, I understand where you are going to, but I would prefer to qualify that. There is no axiomatic respect to authority in science. It doesn't matter that the big guy who's head of the department and a Nobel Prize winner has a certain position. If that position is illogical or doesn't stand up to empirical scrutiny, then it's false, and your authority means exactly nothing. What does apply, though, is that our knowledge of the world is now so broad, so large, and so detailed that it's impossible for any one human being to know everything that is salient about every field of science. And therefore, begrudgingly, we have to defer to somebody who has more expertise in some other field than we have. But that's not an axiomatic thing. It's even we do that begrudgingly. It's because in practice there is no better alternative. But that's not a reification of authority. It's just an acknowledgement that our primate minds are limited and that no single one of us can know everything that there is to know about every field of science. So we have to defer. But I wouldn't consider this a core value of science. This is just a practical limitation, something that we do begrudgingly, but that has no fundamental validity.
Which is why I chose the word respect as opposed to rely on. I was trying to capture what you just said by saying you could respect it.
Yeah, we have to, because we can't know everything, and we have to recognize that people who spent their lives studying those other things are probably better qualified than we are to pass judgment on those other things. We do this begrudgingly because practice forces us to do so.
I will say that all of those criteria are present in both Buddhism and Jainism. And those two movements arose at sort of at the same time in India during India's axial age. India had it, China had it, the West had it. And in India's axial age, there was this Shramana movement, which was a counterculture movement against Orthodox Brahmanism and the rituals and the mythology of that. And these were renunciates that shaved their heads or pulled their hair out in some cases. The Jains actually were, I mean, when I became a Buddhist monk, I was shaved. When you become a Jain monk or nun, they pull your hair out in clumps. So that is those extreme practices. The Buddha was a member of the Jain, proto-Jain group, did those extreme practices for 6 years, and then formulated the middle way, which is still challenging, but at least we don't pull your hair out. So in both of those movements, Buddhism and Jainism, there is it specifically said you can rely on logic and evidence. Of course, I changed that. I said, if you're going to rely on anything, because of what you said, the uncertainty and the limitations that we now know are present in logic. So I'm trying to be really careful in the words. If you're going to rely on anything, rely on logic and evidence. And then it's okay to respect respectable authority.
If you want to be very rigorous in the use of words, it's better to say that those 4 points characterize the scientific spirit as opposed to the scientific method. The method is something else. The method is about formulating a hypothesis, devising an experiment that can refute the hypothesis, setting the experiment up under controlled conditions, and then running it. So the method is something else. But the spirit of science is characterized by at least three of the things you mentioned. And the fourth, less strongly so, under qualification, but
What you just said is great. Contrast the method of science, which is the four things you mentioned. I mean, that's what the Wikipedia says, and I think it's pretty good. I think that's a pretty good characterization of science, what you just said, the scientific method. I would add to that Aristotelian analysis that the purpose or goal or use of science, that the last of the causes, the final cause, in other words, what is this going to be good for? I would say we scientists should put our feet on the ground and our, our arms akimbo and scream to the world. The reason we're doing this is to improve human flourishing. If you have an ethical issue about science, just ask yourself, to what extent is this going to help human flourishing? To what extent it isn't? So I would contrast the method with the spirit that way. So thanks.
the final cause of science is not part of the scientific method. The method does not entail a particular motivation for using it. That's something that happens in the minds of society and scientists. But the final cause itself is not part of the methodology of science.
You're right. Right. It's the final cause is the responsibility of all humans. That the good information that science generates gets translated. It's the responsibility of all humans, but it's especially the responsibility of the humans who generate the science, I'm going to say. So it may not be part of the scientific philosophy, but it should be part of how how the public is allowed to ask the question, what good is science doing for me in terms of my happiness, broadly considered? So I think this issue, whether you decide to place it under the philosophy of what science is, that's fine. You don't have to put it there, you can put it somewhere else. But it needs to be addressed when we're talking about science, I think. So to me, it becomes interesting because it's very evident to me that this would be the way we would look at science from Aristotle's point of view. There's a process, it has a certain form, it has an essence, which is quality information, I'm going to say. And that quality information, what's it good for? Better be good for us humans. And that's our human happiness, or flourishing, I would say, relief, fulfillment, insight, self mastery, a call to service, that kind of stuff. Those would be dimensions of happiness that I think science should address. The way you put your insight and how you came to it without that much systematic practice, Bernardo, that's extraordinary. It really is. My specialty is world mysticism, both to study what they say, but also to experience myself. And you've really got, from my perspective, that thing you said about being set free when you know that you're nature's slave. That's a gift you were given and you can pass it on.
I will say something now that I don't know whether it's true. I sincerely don't know. I can't even say that I think it's true. I may just suspect it. And it may not be true, but I will share it for what it's worth. Your statement was that it's extraordinary that somebody like me without a systematic practice came to that insight.
Well, that particular wording caught my attention. That insight can be stated a gazillion ways, but the way you said it was quite extraordinary from my point of view.
So the hypothesis that I don't know whether it's true or not, but I wanted to float anyway, is that it may not be extraordinary, but because of what you do, there is a pre-selection of the people you come across with. And in that, uh, and I will use this word objectively, not as in a demeaning way, that biased sampling of the population may lead you to conclude that it's extraordinary that somebody without the systematic practice can come to those insights. But maybe it's not. Maybe it's happening all over the place, but the people who get at those insights are not the least interested in talking about them. They are open to talking about them, but they are not going to take the initiative to go talk to their neighbors and their friends and come online to talk about it. It's something they take in as part of their maturation and they live life according to it. But other than that, they are not picking up a megaphone. So we don't hear about them. And we think that when one of them, like me, the most regular, as most regular, in Dutch we have this expression, Jan Modaal. It means John Average. So in Dutch, when we say somebody is Jan Modaal, we mean it's an average person and a guy from the streets. And if you look at how I live my life, I'm extraordinarily average. I may have non-average degrees. People say, "Oh, how can you be average? You have 2 PhDs and you've done this and that." Forget that. Just look at how I go about my day, how I interact with people, the things I like, what I do, and you will realize that I am Jan Modal. I am John Average, through and through. And if you don't believe it, okay, other people don't believe it. I know it. And it's enough that I know it about myself. So that John Average, like me, can have those insights may not be as extraordinary as most people think, because the John Averages are not picking up a megaphone to broadcast to the world what they understood in their lives. For them, it's just the process of becoming more mature, going through the knocks of life, which are endless, and finding a way to reconcile oneself with them and take something out of that, squeezing some water out of that stone. And a lot of us do it, Shinzen. A lot of us do it. I think most people would be surprised how many John Averages are out there with profound insights. I've come across a couple of them. There is something about them that you can identify. If you are one of them, if you're a John Average, you can pick up that John Average vibe. And I will give an interview with one of them in a few days. And that John Average happens to be one that has no degrees. And I don't give the faintest damn that he doesn't have any degrees. I think he's paying attention to life, and that's all I value. I value people who are paying attention to life. And a lot of them have no degrees. And actually, having a degree is a liability. It's part of what nature is trying to do through me, so I accept it, but it's a bloody liability. It fills your mind with conceptual stories that are very distinct from reality. And I'm not saying this to come across as, "Oh, Bernard, look at him, he's so modest." No, I don't give the faintest damn about how I'm perceived in this regard either. I'm just saying it because it's true. At least my truth.
A very special thanks to Anil Pandey, Isms Chisholm, Larry Warshaw, and Michael Middleton for your support of Mew. It's support like yours that helps make this podcast possible. And if you haven't already, you can subscribe to this show on YouTube or on your preferred podcasting platform through the links below or by searching for Mew.